Good afternoon, and everybody, and welcome to the Cyber Loss Prevention Forum, what's now our third webinar. I'm John Davies from RiskWorks Business Services, and I'm here today with my partner in crime, probably not the best phrase, my partner against crime, should I say, Richard Higginbotham from Vault Connect, and we're also delighted to be joined by Nick Holden, who's the Managing Director of Nexus Protect. Before we get cracking, just a couple of bits of admin. It'll follow the usual format, allow around 30 minutes for the presentation and then have 10-15 minutes at the end for any questions you may have. If you've got any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box and we'll get around to them at the end. And if we run short of time or we don't get around to your question, then obviously we'll come back to you afterwards. Lastly, the recording of the webinar will be available on demand after the event, and I think it'll be on both the RiskWorks and Vault Connect websites. So without further ado, I'll pass you now to Richard and Nick. So Richard, the biggest risk wear shoes.
Yes, indeed. And thanks ever so much, Nick, for hosting us today and sharing your time with us on the webcast. Can you tell us briefly what Nexus Protect do?
Certainly, and thank you for having me. Nexus Protect was sort of created from where I sort of came from a commercial background, but in its most simplistic terms, we are, I suppose, a security and organizational resilience practice who take an approach where we look at all aspects of security and how it interlinks. So physical, people, information, data, protection, and cybersecurity from a very sort of, I suppose, early stage of my career in senior management and security, realized that they're all intrinsically linked. And therefore, it's really important to look at it as a whole picture, not just as an individual. But obviously, coming off the back of looking at those, is obviously looking at the incident crisis management off the back of potential incidents. And then also the business continuity. How do we continue to operate as a business? So really, it's come from an experience of working in large organizations where everyone's been doing their own thing and actually putting together the right type of model. And we've taken that from our experience and put it actually in and create our own business.
And so that experience is seeing what goes wrong, how it goes wrong, and what can be happening thereafter. So within that, I guess, as we start to look at cyber and cyber fraud, I guess it's a little bit like the car crash thing. Is it the case that the most faulty element of the whole thing is the soft bit behind the wheel?
Absolutely. And, if I go back probably 10, 15 years when I first sort of went into corporate security, it was very IT led. Everything was about how technology was the best defense. But very quickly realized that actually it's the people that use the technology that can be the weakness. So you can have the world's greatest black box of tricks. However, if that's not managed properly or people are allowed to sort of go against the protocols in place, then obviously that black box of tricks becomes null and void. Okay.
So I guess as people, we are the biggest risk. Is the biggest risk does indeed wear shoes?
Absolutely. And I've probably spent a lot of my time working with the technical cyber professionals, whether that be working for the organizations I have in the past, or individually working with organizations that have suffered cyber incidents and cyber fraud, is working with the technical element of it to understand why did that happen. Mm-hmm. And I'll probably say about 70 to 80% of the time that it is down to human error of some shape or form, or a deliberate act by the human element of it. So like I say, you can have all those things in place, you can have great processes on paper, but if you don't have the right culture, the right people involved, then it can, it really does go downhill very quickly.
So what are we good at getting wrong?
I think a lot of it comes around to, I suppose, if you want to call it a tick box exercise.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be a lot of boards that go, yes, 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 we want this, we understand it, or they believe they understand the risk and say, make it so. That doesn't really necessarily mean that it's going to work, because if you don't really have the proper buy-in from the top, but also from the bottom, then it's never going to succeed, whether that's cybersecurity or just generally doing business. And I think the biggest failure is culture. Mm-hmm. Is that there are people within departments that, they'll sit down and do a 1 hour cyber awareness course on the computer, but actually don't really understand what it's about and how it interacts with the business. And what we find is that because people are more interested in the bottom line profit, etc., that they will, circumvent policy and process and technology to make sure that they can do business. And unfortunately, that starts sometimes at the top end of the tree. It's what is the priority of the business? What is the culture?
So is that down to incompetence, or is it just a lack of awareness?
It can be both. To be perfectly honest, a lack of awareness is obviously one of the main areas, but incompetence, but also that deliberate act where people are doing it either for revenge, your disgruntled employees, or somebody who's out to make a quick buck. I used to work as managing a guarding contract for a large financial institution who had lots of call centres. And what we managed to spot by chance was that when the young call centre staff were going out, mostly students, there was these 1 or 2 cars that kept pulling up next to them. Anyway, we found out what it was. They were offering them large sums of money to pass on details from the call centre, so credit card details, etc., etc. So, where there's a potential weakness or vulnerability, then obviously it's there to be taken advantage of. And that, there was a real eye-opener, and obviously we got the police involved in that situation.
And so I guess humans with our lack of understanding, but also different motivations, if that's not taken into account, that then creates a fundamental risk and a gap in security.
Absolutely. And I think this is where it comes round to where central functions within organisations, however big or small, so HR, procurement, finance, operations, health and safety, if they're not talking and working together, so for example would be disgruntled employee. If you're not made aware that we have a disgruntled employee, or we're going to make redundancies, or we have a very active element within a union, that actually if we're not aware of it, then how can we prepare for any potential instance of problems? And this is where it sort of starts to go wrong, because the left aren't talking to the right. And where you don't have that culture within an organisation, that's where your vulnerabilities open. And like I say, sometimes this could be all down to a changing circumstance of an individual. And talking about the slide here, I call it organisational fragmentation. There's a mouthful for you. But there probably isn't an organisation that I haven't been into where this happens. When I worked with one of the large multinationals as the head of security, one of the key things I started to do, and I took this approach in probably 2010, where we should, as a key stakeholder, we had involvement in every policy that was written from a security perspective, whether it was HR, onboarding and vetting of staff, through to, HR type investigations, dealing with disgruntled employees, because a lot of the contracts were government-based contracts. But what we were finding initially was that, HR would develop a policy, but not interact with anybody else. Finance would do the same, and nobody would talk about it.
So I've heard you talk about silos of independence, so one department often doing it, and then councils of collaboration. So when you talk about councils of collaboration, what are you kind of getting at there? So
councils of collaboration, probably there are 2 forms of council of collaboration. The first one, which is the usual piece, is where something happens and all of a sudden everybody's brought in to deal with the problem and the issue. So it's a knee-jerk reaction. It's reactive, not proactive. So in that situation, like I say, what happens is something has occurred, cyber incident maybe, or any type of incident. Everybody has to get involved because they feel they need to, and not always the case, but they do. And then they, obviously money spent, etc., etc. And they come up with a solution and it's dealt with. But then actually what tends to happen is it sort of dies a death once it's passed, once you've jumped over that hurdle of that incident.
Yeah.
The other councils of collaboration would be actually where you're proactive, where you get together and talk about things, strategy, policy, direction. They're the positive councils of collaboration.
Right, okay. So what we have is we have the obvious one where, okay, one department's going off and they're gonna sort out a policy on this aspect, but there's no communication. So as you said, given the example of the call centre, there's no tie-in with culture and checking up on what people are doing outside. And then on the other one, where you've got kind of your peaks and troughs of we've reacted to something, that then means there's a load of effort, but then it gets forgotten almost immediately afterwards.
Absolutely. And I think that's where organisations fall down. They don't talk to each other. Then something happens, they all pile in and sort of try and solve this problem, and the promises of investment and we'll change this policy, but then there's no usual follow through. And that's where things go wrong. Where you need to be is, if that's the case when it first happens, is then have that move on to those councils of collaboration where you're continuously looking at problems. Because from a cyber perspective, we're always 20 steps behind the people that are trying to do us the damage. So we've got to keep moving forward, even if it's only small steps. And you can only really do that through joined up approach and positive councils of collaboration.
Yep. So you mentioned there being 20 steps behind on cyber. So I guess if the likes of Google, Facebook, Amazon, the NHS, the army, the police, if they can get hacked, anybody can. So it's a case of if it's when, not if. So something's going to happen. You've got to have a policy in place. Let's not beat around the bush. What can happen when it goes wrong?
I think this is a key thing here, is that it is when.
Yeah.
And like with anything else in any organizational resilience, you've got to be aware that these things may and will happen. You've got to identify how this will impact a business. Now, depending on the type of business, obviously, but where it can go wrong, it can go drastically wrong. If you look at SME companies, 60% plus of SMEs that have a cyber incident go out of business. It doesn't matter if you're big. If you talked about the big companies, they're big organizations with big security setups, and it still goes wrong. So you can only do as much as an organization of the size can deal with. Yep. But I'll give you one or two examples. I had a call yesterday from a gentleman who he feels he's been subject to identity fraud, and he was quite panicked about it. He'd taken lots of action but didn't think anything was happening. And I sort of spent half an hour with him on the phone, just trying to go through the things that he'd done to try and potentially alleviate any problems that may come ahead. And unless you've actually been a victim of identity fraud, it can be really, really soul draining and sapping and stressful. People don't forget, when these incidents happen, the amount of stress on the individual as well as a company. At the moment, he's having to monitor what's going on. But another example would be with a large company. We talk about phishing emails. I was working with a company that the phishing email, we tracked back eventually after the incident that it was through a small contract, that actually through the investigation that we ran as, I suppose, the non-technical element of it, we identified that it was an FM contract manager on a small contract who'd not gone any training, who clicked onto an email, which then jumped on, and within a couple of hours, it was on 3,000 email accounts. Wow. Now, we were lucky at the time. We'd done a lot of proactive action around cybersecurity, phishing, etc. And in the end, we had 100 computers that were infected. However, that, it's pretty good figures, really. However, it still costs a considerable amount of money and time and effort. And I think the other thing that companies need to be aware of, apart from potential reputation issue with your clients, is that, we had to stand up a crisis management team straight away, which was senior executives. The operational investigational team was 2 meetings a day, which was 12 people, both technical and non-technical and external. And all those type of things, we had to stop external large-scale data to going out, which is hard for a multi-million-pound company doing multi-million-pound bids. And it took at least 3 or 4 weeks plus to get through that midst crisis.
So that's a lot of management time. It's a major distraction from doing business.
Absolutely.
And that's all as a result of one person who hadn't been trained clicking on a link.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when we come to do this, I mean, you mentioned right at the very beginning a holistic approach, and you gave us this diagram, which I'm going to rudely refer to as kind of the onion rings kind of thing, where you've covered a multitude of levels within here. Is this a all at the same time, or is there an order or a process to
it's very much dependent when for example, we go into a business. It's really dependent on what we're going in. So I'll give you an example. If we're going to look at data protection, there is an IT and cyber element. There is a people element around training awareness. There is a physical element if there is physical documentation involved. So this is where it's all interlinked, and how those then policies and processes, training and awareness. So whenever we go in, depending whichever area we may go in, so we may go and looking at physical security or any one of the individual ones, but actually what we will always find is that at some point, all the other points will be touched upon.
Yeah,
because they're intrinsically linked again. And that then also ties in outside of that too: HR, finance, procurement, board level, operations, health and safety. So again, you take that holistic model, but then you have to look at all the offshoots to where it will impact upon that.
Okay, so this is about risk assessment, isn't it? And I look at John when I say this, is when people come to you and say, oh, I need some cover, is the first thing that you need to know is, well, what are you covering? And so quite often that can be a challenge in terms of people not knowing actually, is the box ticking exercise is, I need cyber cover and I need it in these areas. The informed level is, I do this, I've got these risks.
Yeah, correct. So I suppose there's various different, as Nick was touching on before, the key elements, I suppose, to that are, what are the risks? Have you actually assessed what those risks are? Have you assessed what the severity of those risks and exposures could be? And then on the other side, it's understanding what an insurance policy can do for you to protect, how it can assist, and then you're getting into things like limits of indemnity and what sort of covers are available, and ensuring, therefore, going forward, that you get an insurance policy that adequately covers you.
So it's about knowing your business model. It's knowing about how you interact. And if we go back to that biggest risk, wearing shoes, it's knowing where humans carry out parts of that and where those threats can be. We've talked about balance a number of times now in webinars, but it is that age-old thing is, you can be 100% secure, but you won't make any money, and because you won't have any customers and you won't have any employees. So it's about actually striking that balance in the middle there. So when you're with clients and you're looking at that security and you're assessing those risks, are you also assessing kind of their business models and the processes that they're kind of working through, of what it is that they need to do?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the very first things I really clicked on as a security manager, coming out of the forces and sort of going from that into the commercial world, was you need to understand the business that you're going to be operating in or working with. If you don't do that, then how can you understand their potential risks and impacts? And again, depending on the size and the structure of the organization, what finance do they have? Do they have the resource, the capacity, the capability? Because talking about insurance, and this is one of the key things here, is that when you first take out that insurance, if you've done that risk assessment properly, your premium may be high. But the whole point is, once you've identified the risk, you can then mitigate the risk over a period of time. And what we look to do is try and put a strategy with them around it, around budget as well as training and resource. So therefore, over time, your premium hopefully would come down, or the risk of it actually happening greatly reduces, because you've got to start at the point and you've got to be honest about where that point is. And yes, you may be paying more here. The end game, and where we try to work with our clients, is about, well, actually, what's that journey? I don't have the money this year. What can I do? I'll try doing this. It won't alleviate. It will alleviate some risk, but not all of the risk. But you know what it is, and this is the journey, and let's travel on that journey.
So this is about finding that middle ground of, actually, there's a compromise to be struck between how profitable and low cost I can be, and how easy it is for clients to do business with me, with the compliance element of it, and working with those. Now, the only person who can make informed decisions about where they want to be within there is the business owner, or the person within the business with the responsibility for it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what our job is to identify the risk so that they can make an informed decision about what level of risk they want to take. They may be very high risk, they may be very low risk, but you can't make that decision unless you have that information. I think that's really the key thing. Whatever way we look at it, at the end of the day, we're identifying the levels of risk for that business, the business owner, to make an informed decision, which then obviously works again with the insurance elements of it to make those informed decisions.
Yep. So we go back to our people. Everybody within an organisation that has staff, anybody in a management position has responsibility for those staff. So it is from the top down to the very bottom, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that again is from a business in itself, whether we're looking at it from any aspect, is that everyone has responsibilities, whether it's security, health and safety, delivering whatever they're delivering, etc. What a lot of people don't really necessarily understand from the bottom to the top, especially sometimes at the top, they don't know their actual responsibility and accountabilities. And actually, that's something that we try to help them make them understand, is that everyone has a responsibility around cybersecurity, data protection, whatever it might be. And as that moves up, I suppose the management tree, that responsibility grows, because if I'm a manager of 5 people, I need to make sure that my staff are following the right policy, the processes, etc. And it goes up and up and up. And sometimes we find that actually the top table don't really understand actually the buck stops there. They will try to push that back down the tree. but trying to actually make them understand actually the buck stops with you. Then it actually opens their eyes, and actually we start to have some constructive discussion and actually a way forward.
So the buck stops at the boardroom table, if you like, but then the people who are at the front line have got a huge amount of value to add. I mean, we were sharing anecdotes before we came on mic for this webcast, and you were talking about doing a penetration test within an organisation. It was a cleaner that stopped you in a corridor, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a cleaner and not the staff, which it was supposed to be a relatively secure environment. The staff let us through the side door as usual, but it was a cleaner that challenged us, and it was actually a really breath of fresh air. And it was an internal penetration test. Is actually we made sure that person was actually congratulated and received an award, because it was quite fun. We were in that building for nearly an hour and a half, push up to 2 hours before that challenge. So congratulations on that piece. But people do have a part to play.
So those people at the front line feeling like they've got some ownership, feeling like they're involved in assessing the risks, is enormously valuable to getting this done. So you've pointed us in the direction of some resources to help business, and I note that right at the centre of this is set up your risk management regime. This is a resource from the National Cyber Security Centre.
Yeah, so you don't have to go out and spend hundreds of thousands of pounds or thousands of pounds on it. There's a lot of really good literature out there, and the National Cybersecurity Centre is a really good place to start, especially for small businesses. It just gives you an idea, especially in a graphic, rather than lots of slides and a good graphics like the ones that are available. Just give you an idea of the types of things you should be looking at. Obviously, the next stage is actually understanding that, but there is some really good things out there you can start to look at without having necessarily to engage people, but at least it gives you an idea of the types of problems and issues you need to be looking at.
So I guess what we've got there is what this is going to give clues to what your unknown unknowns are. Yes. Is the things that you didn't know that you were supposed to be doing. Once you've got a picture of that, then that's giving you some hints and tips of the direction of travel from that point
on. And that's it. And the sooner you start this type of thing, the better, especially as a growing business. And this is where we do a lot of work, is with growing businesses, to try to put this plan in place, to step by step, to know that in the future they need to be taking these steps, rather than a lot of companies who, we're talking, 30, 40, 50 million pound companies who just sold so much, they've grown so fast, they forgot to put the foundation in behind. And now they're starting to struggle and having issues and problems, which in theory could have a huge impact on the business, both, internally, but also perspective, because the bigger you get, the bigger the clients you get. Again, obviously what we're finding now is clients are becoming more aware and due diligence of supply chain, because obviously supply chain is weak. But if you look at a lot of the big breaches recently, it's through the supply chain. It's probably through a person in the supply chain not following maybe their own process, but actually not that business not taking on or understanding the client's processes and protocols, and it's a backdoor in. So good place to start for 10, and especially for small businesses. I think once you start to grow that business, and especially around data, and we understand the data protection regulations now, is that you've got to take this element so much more seriously because of the passage of information. Brexit or no Brexit, it doesn't matter. We're going to be transferring data, not just into Europe, but around the world. And to be able to look after that data is hugely important. And if you don't start looking at this now, even as a growing business, then you are going to have problems in the future. But what we're also finding now in the data protection area is that clients now are becoming more aware that they have a responsibility to try and mitigate some of their liability to make sure their supply chain are following it. And part of that is cybersecurity. It's about training of people, awareness of people. So it's a big circle. It all comes back round, and people are the fundamental part of it.
I guess one of the things with this is because there's technology involved, and because the technology is changing all the time, and actually you listen to the news, and some of the things that hackers are doing sounds enormously technically and enormously sophisticated. It can be quite intimidating to tackle, but actually some of the steps that you can take are relatively simple, aren't they?
Absolutely. People think there is a lot of it sounds very technical, but a lot of the basic breaches are really simple stuff. People call it social engineering. And you've got things like, for small business, Cyber Essentials, which set out the basic hygiene levels for good IT security. Even that type of sort of starting at that level. But again, it is about people clicking on emails and things like that. These are the breaches where the ransomware comes in and things like that. When you're going to the more technical areas, you're talking about the bigger companies. There are a lot of things that are just thrown out there by hackers and just to see what comes back. And yes, they will pick up on smaller companies, but as we've seen, they pick up on big companies, even like the NHS, when you look at WannaCry. So a lot of the things you can do are really simple. Make your staff feel and become responsible for that. Tie that into their education awareness, tie that into what they do at home. Because the risks they face at work are the same as they do at home, identity theft and things like that. So again, it's about how you deliver that into your organization.
Okay, I've just been, somebody's just asked me a question on there. Will a copy of the presentation be available after the event? Yes, it'll be available as video on demand afterwards. So you've got some tips here, as I guess a variation on the 4 Ps here it's about preparation, isn't it, and about understanding.
It is, and even as a small business, as you start to grow, and whether you sort of went from 1 to 50 staff, from an IT perspective, yes, you've got to find the right IT provider that is proactive and not just trying to sell you a service. But you've got to start looking at things like acceptable use policies, what staff can and can't do with the hardware that you are providing for them. If they're using their own hardware, what are we doing to alleviate that? And we work a lot with schools, and staff use their own laptops, and then the kids on every weekend, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just about putting some really common sense approaches in there, especially as you start to grow. We talk about firewalls and all the technical element, but just putting in good acceptable use policy, making sure people realize that if they do breach it, that there is a consequence. Because what we find is there's some really good stuff, policies in an organization, but there's no consequence to them not following it, and they get away with it. Therefore, that culture just becomes, well, what does it matter? Nothing's going to happen to me. So again, make sure you've got simple, straightforward policies, make sure people understand them. There's plenty of online free training out there about the basics, and you can find them on things like the National Cybersecurity Centre, Cyber Aware. There's lots of sites that can work with small businesses. But then things, when you start to grow, that's when you need to start to look at more of a professional approach, as in the sense of growing and facilitating that journey.
And that's absolutely in line with the latest privacy regulations of things like data privacy impact assessments. If you are changing a process as you are growing, you should be taking a risk assessment within there. But I guess again, getting past box ticking is just, I've done a risk assessment isn't enough, is get the people involved in doing it who are on the front line to think about what could go wrong.
And I think, the way we usually do it is by providing examples of where it's gone wrong, hundreds of different examples in different ways, means and shapes. But with data protection as an example, and, a lot of businesses, this is where a cyber incident, it almost becomes a double whammy. And if you do, credit card information, it becomes a triple whammy, because you're losing data, then you have issue with your merchants, and then also, and it snowballs. So basically, it's about making people responsible, having the right policies in place, educating them, making them feel part of the business, which is good for general business anyway. Treat them how you'd expect to be treated, because there's just the only way really you're going to get their buy-in from that, and involve them in the growth. Help them make some of the decisions with you if they're that type of organization.
So I guess let's get to the summary. We're actually bang on our 30 minutes as well for this. We've got some time for questions and answers as those have come through. So first, where it's easier to hack pinkware, or you and I, than it is to hack software.
Absolutely, you can't say anybody. It's the easy option, whether they're leaving the back door open, the smoking shed, or they're letting you walk through the front door to gather the information to be able to start to social engineer individuals or a business. The amount of information people put on things like Facebook, Twitter, and all the social media accounts. Just a quick example. Every time a new director came into the business, when he came to his first board meeting, there was a brown envelope on his desk in the seat, and in that envelope was his digital footprint. So we'd gone and looked what his digital footprint looked like, and obviously all the others were quite chuckling about that because they knew what was coming. So again, just be wary of what your digital footprint is and what your people are doing.
Error is as dangerous as attack.
And to be honest, most breaches that occur, definitely with SMEs, are from error. Lack of understanding and knowledge, clicking on the wrong thing, maybe thinking it's an email from the CEO. That seems to be a big one at the moment.
Well, and actually, that email from the CEO, and just going back to the social media profile, there is the classic example there that illustrates that it's not necessarily the low-paid people at the front line who are at fault in this. Is the classic of the CEO going on holiday and plastering his holiday all over social media, advertising the fact to fraudsters that he's away, he's out of the country, and that CEO fraud strike can be made. So yeah, it can happen to anyone. Consequences, they can be bad, they can be big.
Oh, they can be huge. I mean, you look at the data protection elements of it, but like I say, we talked about the PCI DSS elements of it. But then what a lot of businesses don't take into account is reputational damage. How much will it impact you? Do your clients want to work with a company that has had a serious data breach? Now, it might not even been their data, but it doesn't matter. You know, I would rather go somewhere where I feel safe and comfortable. And this is a really good piece around, if you can evidence the work you've done and evidence that in these situations, then you're more likely to win a contract than somebody who can't. So, you know, the consequences, you know, on multiple different levels, but reputationally, you know, major data breach can end your business. And that's why 60% plus of SMEs go out of business.
So I guess what I'm hearing there is being proactive and having a lot of rigor around process is just good business anyway. Is failing to do that, and we talked a little bit around this in the first webinar we did with those kind of 9-10 areas of hidden costs, is some of those costs can be totally unexpected.
Well, not only have you got let's say, for example, in a cyber attack, the IT forensic costs and the cyber security elements, as Nick was talking about, as well as the words I'm looking for, it's the costs.
It's the cost of people, the
hours, the training, the getting back the lost business, the PR. Like, you know, with good PR after an event, you can sometimes say, look, you can put a positive spin on it. Say, look, we've been attacked. This has happened. This is what we've done to rectify that. And there are ways of building back up, but it costs time, it costs money, and it's going back to time, as Nick was saying at the start, with how much time gets spent by management and senior levels actually getting to a position you were prior to the attack.
Yep. So IT's a small element of this. It's the favoured attack of the remote criminal, but it's information, it's people, it's physical.
Yeah, and I think we've found probably over the last couple of years now where you're looking, especially larger organisations where the board is heavily IT based. There's not always a head of security that is a generalist. It's very much IT based because most companies are reliant on IT infrastructure. What we're finding now is actually we're finding that coercion between the security specialists. I always talk security management. There are different disciplines within security management. So when someone writes a security policy, it should cover all the aspects, not just the cyber elements of it, the people elements. And the people elements should be, security elements should be in the HR policy, and they should be in the finance policy, and they should be in the procurement policy around due diligence. So IT is only an element of it. It facilitates business, but it's the people that then do the business.
So I've got a question here. As somebody who is sat here with kind of massaging the temples and thinking, oh my God, this sounds like a completely alien organization to mine. What would be your recommended first step towards becoming a more secure and more rigorous organization?
I think, depending on the size of organization. So if you look at large organizations, let's put them to one side. They've got security infrastructure, or should have. The growing businesses, even the small businesses growing, you've got to look at especially if you're using a third-party IT supplier, go to the market and find the right people who want to work, who want to be proactive. They don't want to sell you a service. You want people to be giving you information. You want them to tell you, actually, there are a lot of people sniffing around your website or whatever it is, whether that's a positive thing or a bad thing. So you've got to find the right supplier that's providing the right type of services. And sometimes it's hard for that if you don't understand what you actually need and want. You just get sold what they think you need. I think then also being very aware of your environment. So again, can people walk in? Do people leave their passwords lying around? Do they leave confidential documents lying around within your office? Do people go and quite happily talk about commercial business in the pub next door? Yep. So it's just making people aware of their environment, both internally within your organization, but also when you go out. One of the things we used to do quite a lot of is we'd go and sit in a hotel, maybe where there's a conference on or something like that, and one of the companies would be asking us to pick up if any of their executives we're talking out of turn, especially after a few gin and tonics and white wines. So again, be wary of, and that's all about staff training and awareness. Take them on the journey with you, but look at all the different aspects, as we've said there, physical, people, information, data.
So maybe, and again, using the resources that are available to you. So maybe a good homework for somebody who is massaging their temples and starting to get sweaty palms and a bit of a quiver on coming out of this is log on to the National Cybersecurity website, go and download the resources, look at what it's describing, compare that with your organisation. And yeah, if you've got a staff briefing coming up, is starting getting people to think proactively.
You know, and again, I was talking to a potential client today about it, and yes, they have an annual awareness program. They have a data protection, they have anti-bribery corruption, and you know, 30, 40 minutes, an hour long, and they can. I said, but really, that's great, that's fine. It's ticking a box. What happens is they sit there, they have to sit there, so they go through it. They don't really absorb that information. What does get absorbed is lots of little bits. So yes, you do your annual awareness stuff, but actually what you do is you feed them team briefings, little briefs, whether that's a health and safety moment or a security moment. The little things then, you know, because you're talking about them on a regular basis, soak into the subconscious. So therefore, they're more likely to act upon it when they have a suspicion or an issue, because they're not sat 8 months ago. They've actually been talking about phishing, or they've been talking about social engineering, or they've been talking about clear desk policy a week ago in the last team talk. So just doing those little things, pull off the literature there, show them the slide, go through the slide and have a conversation about it.
Yeah. And I guess you know that it's happening when you start to get those risks thrown back at you as kind of, oh, we do this, that's a bit dangerous. Is when that's coming from the front line, then
it is. And that's one of the key things we do when we don't just go and interview the board. We actually are, where we get most of our really good intelligence and information from, is we will sit down with people on the ground, because we need to understand, has the training been effective? You know, what is the culture around that element, around, you know, consequence to not following? That's where we really get the juicy stuff. And then it's quite, you know, funny to sit at the board and tell them that, because they think everything's, you know, sweet as pie and everything, but actually it's a totally different picture 4 levels down.
Yeah. So we've kind of cut through the questions here. I think we've got another. So if there are any more questions, please throw them in now, because we're going to wrap up over the next 5 minutes, and so we'll try and make sure that those are answered before the end. Just coming back to this, awareness was kind of the whole vision, where when John and I first sat down and started talking about this was about raising awareness of some of the threats, some of the risks. We've got another event coming up on 10th of April, which is a morning event this time, and it's going to be hosted by IT Lab. We're going to be running through that some research that they've done of businesses of a range of sizes and across a range of sectors, which really covers their approach to what we've been discussing today. And having looked at what we've got in there already, there are some fairly eye-opening statistics within there in terms of the number of people who've got gaps in exactly the areas that we've talked about within there. As ever, this webinar will be available to view on demand. It'll be available on Vault Connect and the RiskWorks website. So that'll be vaultconnect.co.uk/cyber, and it's the cyber liability page on.
Yeah, that's right. And you can get a link from it's www.riskworksbusiness.com.
Okay. So those will be available on demand afterwards. So a huge thank you to Nick. That's been enormously valuable, just listening and thinking through this topic here. Thanks as ever to Jonathan for kind of putting this together and getting it together. If you have got any questions that have not been raised on here, or you didn't want to raise in public, by all means send them to us on email, and any one of the three of us will be quite happy to kind of jump in and get those questions answered, and even have a discussion of it if that's what you feel is necessary. If you want to get in touch, my email is richard@vaultconnect.co.uk, or Jonathan at...
It's Jonathan D at riskworksbusiness.com. Bit of a mouthful.
And Nick?
Nick at nexus-global.co.uk.
Fantastic. Well, that's been the Cyber Loss Prevention Forum. Your biggest risk wears shoes. Thank you very much for your time, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.